Welcome to the Aaron Harber Show. My guest today is the Dean of Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies, Vali Nassr. Dean Nassr, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, my pleasure to have you. An expert on the Middle East. I would love to talk about the Middle East. Let's talk a little bit about the school, though. I mean, you are certainly the SAIS. It has a tremendous national and international reputation. And being in Washington gives you an advantage over some of your competitor schools, as it were. You're right in the middle of diplomacy.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about where the school is going these days.
Well, this is a school that has trained generations of global leaders, and this is in fields of international affairs, diplomacy, but increasingly also dealing with critical global issues like climate change, energy, water, and the like. We have a strategic perspective about how our students ought to be able to deal with all of these issues under the same rubric, have capability to analyze, understand history, know languages, be able to be problem solvers, and be able to operate in a global environment. And ultimately, that's the direction in which the world is going, an integrated world with a lot of problems that cross over many traditional areas that we're concerned with. And I think that's what the world needs in the young, aspiring leaders coming up.
Certainly, the leaders at the top of our country in Congress, in the House, and the Senate, in cabinet positions, the presidency on down, all need to have those skills. But my sense is most of them don't. And that when you look at different schools of international affairs, public affairs, that a lot of the graduates don't achieve or get to that level where they probably would benefit the country the most. Is that a special challenge, or is there an effort on the part of the school to encourage graduates to pursue paths which may help them get to that point where they can really make a much bigger difference?
Well, we definitely would love for a lot of our students to go to public service, but when you have sequestration by Congress and government shutdown and you know, the State Department or the Pentagon are not hiring, it's very difficult to tell people to go into public service. But then nevertheless, a good chunk of our graduates end up working on Capitol Hill in various branches of the government, for the White House, for the military. And even though their bosses may have come through the political process and not know international affairs, they're nevertheless there to provide them with the right service so that the job of the US government in international affairs is done. But the larger problem is outside of our school. And that is that how does the various branches of the government balance the political incentives and instincts of leaders vis-a-vis what needs to happen in order for America's interest in international affairs to be pushed forward. For instance, is it a good idea for us to have a trade deal with Asia? How do we do it? And then as opposed to how it's going to play out in Middle America, and same with Middle East issues and the like. That's an issue that's larger than us. But we do try to play a thought leadership role outside of the classroom in Washington as well, where we have convening power to bring together academics, intellectual leaders, media, government folks, private sector together to at least to be able to discuss critical global issues outside of their work environment and perhaps come up with new ideas how to solve them.
Is there a way to, I know that when Congress, there's a new election, in recent decades, Harvard, for example, has brought the freshman Congress to the university. And my sense is the number of attendees and the percentage has declined at that orientation, as it were, over time. Is there a way to better prepare our political leaders than what we're doing? And the contrast is, my experience with the military, I'm always amazed at certainly how well prepared, how well educated, how well informed our military leaders are. I don't see that with our political leaders. How do we address that challenge, and how can the school contribute to that?
Well, you see, for military leaders or for people in the State Department or the CIA, foreign affairs is part of their day job. For people in Congress or elected political leaders, governors, mayors, etc., foreign affairs is not part of their day job. If anything, it's going to count against them with the voters. And therefore, they only deal with it when there is a problem they need to solve. And partly it is to educate them that they really cannot hide away from international issues. So climate issues are global. They'll visit on your city as well. Or energy prices ultimately affect you as well. So you better have a handle on these. Or that there are some of the problems you're encountering here are solved in a different way successfully elsewhere. Don't you want to know about them? Now, it's important to engage them, as Harvard does, as many think tanks do, as we do at SAIS, and talk to them about global affairs. But it's also very important to engage the staffers that actually provide them with day in, day out advice and help them do their work. And then it's important to keep those people abreast as well. So the foreign policy establishment of schools like us are not appreciated, but nevertheless we have to do the job that I think the United States very much needs us to do.
You're a foreign policy expert. And you're engaged in a number of ways in national and international organizations, providing leadership. Do you think U.S. foreign policy is broken?
Well, it is at a difficult spot, I would say. It has certain tactical successes and certain tactical failures. But what is really missing is a sense of direction. So where are we going? What kind of a world do we want? What kind of scenarios do we want in different parts of the world? And how are we going to achieve them? And I think the sense that we used to have in the 60s, 70s, 80s of why does foreign policy matter to our health, to our prosperity, to our security, is not there. So foreign policy for many people has been reduced just to counterterrorism. And then counterterrorism is understood very narrowly as some kind of warfare. But the much sort of broader sense of how do we operate in the world and maximize our interest and why is that a good thing, I think it's lost. And as a result, when we come upon particular crises, we don't have a sense of the larger picture. And generally when you look at presidential campaigns for Congress, you don't sense that those running in it understand the bigger issues, or that they convey it to the American public, that they convey to the American public, why does our role in the world matter? Why do we need a certain kind of a world? And so you come up with this sort of idea, well, we don't want to have anything to do with it. Let them go solve their own problems. And that is such a sort of naive assessment, as if you can somehow exclude yourself from whatever happens in the world. So I would say, the Obama administration has been experimenting with sort of a minimalist foreign policy, with getting out of the Middle East, getting into Asia, trying to handle the Ukraine crisis differently from before. The verdict is not in on all of these scenarios. But I think it's a very interesting and a dangerous time for American foreign policy, because if we go down the wrong path, then there would be consequences for the U.S.
All right, when we come back, let's talk about some of the, I think the conflicts that you just raised in terms of, the Far East, Ukraine, what's going on in the Middle East, Afghanistan, Iraq, et cetera. I'd really like your take on all those. We'll be back with Dean Vali Nassr in just a moment.
Russia sees imperial expansion as more important than GDP right now. And so it's important to get a better sense of what the thinking in other countries is, what their mood is, and how that might play out.
I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. We depend on contributions to support our work to bring you some of the nation's and world's top opinion leaders. Individuals, businesses, foundations, and other nonprofits make tax-deductible contributions to the Democracy and Media Education Foundation to allow us to work for you. To find out more or to make a donation, please go to dmefd.org. Thanks for watching the show and for your support. I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. You can follow the show on Twitter and find us on Facebook to get all the latest updates, see behind-the-scene photos, and make comments and ask me questions. You can see episodes before their TV broadcast, so like the show today.
Your opinions, ideas, suggestions, and criticisms related to guests, topics, questions, or the host are welcome. Please send an email to producer@harbortv.com.
Welcome back to the show. I'm with Dean Vali Nassr, head of the SAIS, and do you just say
We say SAIS.
SAIS, head of SAIS at the Johns Hopkins University. So we were talking about different areas of conflict. When you look at any of these, so let's start with Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't seem that we've certainly dissuaded Russia from leaving that region, that area. What can we do? What should we have done? What's a lesson we should have learned from Ukraine?
Well, first of all, there's a larger issue that the ideas that we had that globalization is going to bring the world together, and that old ideas of nationalism and expansionism and imperial ambition are going to go away, and countries are going to only be guided by the desire to prosper, and that means more engagement with Wall Street and the United States, is actually not correct. That, to our chagrin, Russia sees imperial expansion as more important than GDP right now. And so it's important to get a better sense of what the thinking in other countries is, what their mood is, and how that might play out. And then we have to be very clear about what the boundary lines are, and how do you actually send the right signals in a conflict to make sure that the other side understands how far it can go and does not go to a point where it becomes a much larger crisis. So I think earlier on, we should have been much tougher in terms of signaling to Putin that, yes, we might be willing to talk about the future of Ukraine so it wouldn't be threatening to Russia, but we're not going to be reconciled to him carving out different parts of Ukraine and then basically trying to turn Ukraine into some kind of a Russian vassal. So it's not about the specifics so much of what policy you choose. It's rather about assertion of American leadership in a conflict and the willingness to actually stare the other side down and see the end to this in the right way. I think that's the much larger issue. Now, once you make that decision, then you could ask what set of signals would convey that message to the Russians.
So assuming we sent mixed signals, which I think is a fair assessment, even if we had sent very well-defined signals, would it have mattered? I mean, if we were not willing to get involved militarily, what difference would it have made? Or what could we have done which would have prevented what has happened in Crimea and certainly the rest of Ukraine?
Well, I mean, once you start by saying, well, we're not going to get military involved, and we actually believe the Europeans really should take the leadership, you already are defining for Putin how much room does he have to go.
A lot of room.
A lot of room. Because he knows the Europeans are divided, they depend on him for gas, they never have in the past number of decades been at the forefront of a global conflict. So basically letting the Germans decide the tempo of the conflict means that instead of having a month, he might have a year to work this out. We should not take the issue of military reaction of some sort off the table. I mean, in the end, the idea of forcible annexation of territory is a huge threat to stability of international order. The United States put together a coalition to prevent Saddam Hussein doing that in Kuwait. I mean, you could say perhaps Saddam's historical claims to Kuwait were equally strong as Russia's claims to Crimea. But if you were willing to put together a coalition to actually drive Saddam out of the Kuwait, but here you have basically, in a de facto way, already accepted Crimea going to the Russians. The question is, what else is it going to take? So that provides a very powerful signal. But this all came because we were not resolute in our own minds about what role foreign policy or international stability or European stability plays. So I mean, if we said that we're going to focus on Asia, and Europe and the Middle East really don't matter that much, and the conflicts there don't matter that much, and if you start with that kind of a mindset, then you're not likely to react in time. And I still think Putin has to understand very clear red lines. He really has to take a U.S. position seriously.
But he doesn't. I mean, I think, isn't his read of the U.S. really quite accurate? He sees the country as one that has moved toward in an isolationist manner, whose population is not enthusiastic about engaging anywhere militarily, and he feels he has pretty much free reign.
Well, I wouldn't call the U.S. isolation, I would call it minimalist. We're not withdrawing from the war, we just don't want to take leadership in its affairs, and this is a very different conception. Secondly, I think actually it's really up to American leaders to bring the public opinion with them. You cannot lead from behind the polls. You have to actually lead the polls. And I think some of this perception didn't happen on the ground in Russia, it happened in Syria. So when we basically said, you know, however catastrophic Syria is, we're not going to get involved. We're willing to say really tough things like, if you use chemical weapons, that's a red line. And then when it came to the red line, we hid behind the American public that, well, we really didn't mean the red line, and Congress, as representative American people, should vote on this. So, you know, the question of red lines became quite ambiguous. So, you know, it's important also to understand interdependence. You know, when we sort of drew a red line in Syria, it really was a red line for three other bigger problems. It was a red line for Russia, it was a red line for China, and it was a red line for Iran. And when we didn't observe that red line, those governments concluded that red lines are not meaningful. So in some ways, actually, we should have managed Russia in Syria.
Speaking of managing Russia and Syria, how about managing Syria in Syria? As that conflict unfolded fairly early now, looking back in that conflict, it appeared that the rebels were actually doing well and had the opportunity to topple the government. We failed to give them any kind of significant support. And over time, the Assad government really turned the tables. Of course, now I'm not sure how you would describe the situation today with ISIL and everything that's gone on. Did we make a real mistake in not getting involved at that earlier point?
I think so. Not that necessarily Syria would have had a better outcome. I mean, there's always people who point to the case of Libya, where we did help remove Gaddafi from power, and the result was not a smooth transition to something better. That may have happened in Syria as well. But letting the conflict go without intervening was based on an assumption. The assumption was that whatever happens in Syria will not be of clear and present danger to the United States. It will not really rise to the level of vital national interest. And then came along ISIS, which basically resurrected American fear of terrorism. And terrorism is a domestic American issue. It's not so much an international issue. And then the administration, I think, blinked. It went back on its own assumption. So, you know, the original assumption basically said, okay, Sarah, whatever happens, it's not our concern. Now, all of a sudden, we see that that's actually not true, but we haven't actually hit a reset button. We haven't really got re-engaged in Syria. So we're still holding on to the old rhetoric, Assad must go, but Assad must go is not a policy, it's an aspiration. I mean, the policy ought to be, how do you stop this conflict, stop ISIS in its track, and have a strategy of rolling ISIS back, and then have a stability that you can take your hands off of Syria. That is not in play. The administration does not have a policy towards Syria. And so even though defending not having a policy now is more difficult than it was 2 years ago.
Yeah, so I think you're being polite in that assessment. All right, we're going to take our last break and be back with Dean Vali Nassr.
Well, generally, you know, we haven't been appreciative of history. It's very rare that you have a Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski who came from academia with that kind of a historical perspective. Many of our top foreign policy hands are actually lawyers.
For information on how to help promote civil and mutually respectful discourse and support expansion of the distribution of our programs, please email info@harbertv.com.
Hi, I'm Aaron Harber, host of The Aaron Harber Show. For information about the program, who our upcoming guests and topics are, and ways you can participate, please go to our website. That's harbertv.com. And most of all, thanks for watching.
I'm Mary Robinson, former President of Ireland.
Hi, I'm Jim Cameron, Director of Avatar.
I'm Christina Johnson, former Undersecretary of Energy.
Hi, I'm Oliver Stone.
Hi, I'm Mike Peters. I'm the creator of Mother Goose and Grimm.
watch the Aaron Harber Show.
I would encourage you to watch the Aaron Harber Show. It's good fun.
Watch the Aaron Harber Show because he's a really cool guy.
Please watch the Aaron Harber Show, on which I do appear.
I want you to watch the Aaron Harber Show. Grimmy watches it every day.
Welcome back to the show, our last segment with Dean Vali Nassr from Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. Mr. Dean, was it a huge or small or not a mistake to invade Iraq? What's your assessment looking now that you have hindsight?
Well, it was a mistake to invade Iraq, both with the benefit of hindsight, but even at that point in time, the assumptions appeared to be exaggerated, that somehow our invasion would create a democratic Iraq, which then would democratize the rest of the region and solve our larger problems. So it was a mistake largely because it didn't achieve any of our goals. Yes, Saddam was removed, but we weren't able or haven't been able to guarantee Iraq's territorial integrity. We haven't been able to give Iraq a functioning political system, and the country is not even capable of defending its own borders or provide security internally. And then we seem to have set in motion a conflict that was probably simmering below the surface but was not out in the open, which is the fight over control of power between the different sects of Islam, the Shias and Sunnis. And then, what we started with the invasion of Iraq, Arab Spring spread to the rest of the region, which is also shattering states and sparking conflicts between Shias and Sunnis in Bahrain, in Syria, in Lebanon, in other places. So in a way, we don't know where this ends. It may have a really terrible ending, or this might be a purge that the region needs in order to get to the next phase. But I think the United States would always be credited for not having been the status quo, guarantor, but at some point in time, unbeknownst to itself, having been the start of change, having sort of set the fuse that basically blew up the post-World War I, architecture of the region, both internally in terms of distribution of power, but also even in terms of territorial borders. So, in some ways, this is not about whether Saddam had nuclear weapons or whether this was a justified war. I think in the long duration of history, this is what will be credited for, which is having started the whole-scale transformation of the Middle East.
Yeah, for better or for worse.
For better or for worse.
You mentioned history. Do you have a sense, given your position academically and your experience and your expertise, that we have leadership in Washington that really doesn't have a knowledge or sense of history, that is unable to look ahead and see what some of the pitfalls of certain policy decisions are?
Well, generally, we haven't been appreciative of history. It's very rare that you have a Henry Kissinger or Zbigniew Brzezinski who came from academia with that kind of a historical perspective. Many of our top foreign policy hands are actually lawyers, trained in the legal profession to look at the merits of a particular case without, thinking much more broadly beyond it. That we often our governments designed for dealing with trees rather than the forest. And that's something that's periodically gets us into trouble. Not understanding the way in which World War I calcified the Middle East in an imperfect balance between minorities and majorities, unsettled borders, and dictatorships, and not understanding that to many things in this region there is an antecedent, there is a historical perspective that visits. But that's a trait of American foreign policy. We're short of memory. We look forward, whereas many other people look backwards. That's their sort of coordinates by which they gauge their way forward. So Putin thinks of the Tsarist control of Ukraine, or people in the Middle East think about the Ottoman boundary lines, or the Chinese think of the Middle Empire. We don't think like that. We think forward, but we have to be conscious about that. And that ultimately is part of our power, but is also periodically is a handicap.
Is it a handicap in terms of looking at what the future of Iraq is going to be? And let's talk about it in the context of the borders that you just discussed.
Well, it is, because when we don't understand history, we then latch on to shibboleths that are easy for us to understand. So it's all Iran's fault, or it's all ISIS's fault, or why can't they get along and be a single people? Not understanding that there is several decades or several centuries of sometimes bad blood. The same was true of also the Balkans. It was incomprehensible for us why they were at each other's throat about things that happened in the 13th century. But that's a pitfall, and I think in understanding Iraq is that it is to our advantage for Iraq to stay unitary. But for it to stay unitary, we have to be engaged at much more than a simplistic way of why can the Shiites be a little nicer to the Sunnis. And if they're a little nicer to the Sunnis, then the Sunnis would accept them, and somehow the problem would go away. This is really about division of power. And ultimately, there are winners and losers about how the power gets distributed. The winners can be magnanimous, but the losers also could reject the verdict and continue to fight. We have to have a much better sense of where are these people coming to this historical point from. And why is it that being a little nice to Sunnis is not enough? And why is it the Shiites have such difficulty being nice to Sunnis? What are the Shiites' psychological insecurities? And why is it that it's so difficult for Sunnis to accept Shiites as ruling over them? I mean, these are not issues that you could just say, let's shake hands and get over it. And I think that's missing in our public discussion. And I think because a lot of our politicians, as you mentioned, don't have an independent sense of foreign policy and are very much guided by the public mood, this sort of absence of sophistication in the public mood gets reflected in how they approach policymaking.
In terms of the public mood, looking at it globally, how do you think America is perceived today, and how has that evolved over the past 2 decades, especially given our military activities in Afghanistan, in Iraq, elsewhere in the Middle East as well?
Well, previously we were always focused on what the people think about the United States, and they're always negative. There was all these conspiracy theories that we were too pro-Israel, they were doing all the wrong things, we were invading countries, etc. Now we're actually dealing with something very new, which is the perception among the leaders about the Middle East. This wasn't a problem before, and that's not the same thing. So the people in the Middle East may be angry at American overreach. The leaders in the Middle East are actually becoming distrustful of American resolve and believe that they're going to be hurt by this approach that we have, that we really don't want to have much to do with the Middle East, and we want to leave this place, and you're on your own. And therefore, for the first time, we're actually seeing it. We're seeing a different kind of a reaction among the leaders. We always took that for granted, that our allies understood things and they weren't the ones questioning, it was their people, right? The people are still cynical about us, but now so are the leaders for different reasons. And that actually makes it much more difficult to carry policy, because a lot of these leaders no longer are convinced that they should hitch their wagon to us, or they don't believe that we know what we're doing, or they say, well, if you're leaving, then go. We have to come up with our own plans. And if you're not going to go into Syria, we're going to figure out how to do this on our own. And that actually will make things much more complicated for us.
All right. Mr. Dean, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
That was Vali Nassr, the Dean of Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Studies. I'm Aaron Harber. Thanks for watching.